Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to introduce you again to a professor that I spoke to during the election. Had some really interesting points of view as to what should be the policies during the election campaign that weren't being paid enough attention to. His name is Daniel Beland. He is the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada at McGill University and the James McGill Professor in the Department of Political Science. And tonight, sir, you wanted to talk about equalization. It was a big issue in Alberta recently. You tell me, what do you think the issues are that we've got to think about in regards to equalization in Canada today?
Well, the first thing we must understand is that equalization is part of a bigger picture in terms of fiscal federalism. So we have three major federal transfers to the provinces in this country. We have the largest of these transfers, which is the Canada Health Transfer, which is about $45 billion a year. And all the provinces receive money on a per capita basis based on their population. Then you have the Canada Social Transfer, which is much smaller, but $16–17 billion a year. And that's also for all the provinces on the per capita basis. And finally, you have equalization, which is worth about $20 billion a year right now.
$20 billion.
$20 billion a year, and the money only goes to provinces that are below the national average in terms of fiscal capacity. That is their capacity to raise revenues. So basically, richer provinces are excluded from equalization. But it's important to understand they are not excluded from the Canada Health Transfer or the Canada Social Transfer. And so I think that's equalization has a different role than the Canada Health Transfer and Canada Social Transfer, because its explicit goal is to reduce inequalities among provinces so that poorer provinces can still offer good services to their population without an excessive level of taxation. And so this is a program, equalization, that was created in 1957. And all the provinces in Canada have received equalization at one time or another. But Alberta is the province that hasn't received equalization for the longest period of time, because they received equalization only from 1957 to the early 1960s. And since then, because of the oil boom and energy revenues, Alberta has been excluded from equalization payments. But all the provinces at one time or another, including Ontario, have received equalization.
That's surprising to a lot of people that Ontario would have been a recipient of equalization.
Yes.
When did that occur?
It occurred for about a decade in the 2010, so the previous decade. And it's possible that Ontario will receive equalization again soon. And there is an article that was published very recently by Trevor Toom from the University of Calgary, an economist there, on a website called Finances of the Nation. And he argues that as soon as next year, it's possible that Saskatchewan, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Ontario will receive equalization again on the top of the 5 provinces that currently receive equalization: New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, and of course Quebec. So that might be a major change. The identity of the provinces that receive equalization changes over time. Some provinces get in and out on a regular basis, and others have received money since the very beginning of the program. That's the case of New Brunswick, Manitoba, and Quebec, for example.
We're chatting tonight with Daniel Beland, a professor at McGill University, about equalization. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more. On this topic of equalization, I want to ask him about how it's actually decided, this concept of fiscal capacity, I think he referred to, and then some of the politics about it. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting with professor at McGill University, Danielle Beland, who is an expert on a lot of political issues occurring in Canada today, particularly the challenging ones. And we talked a lot about infrastructure and some of the issues that weren't being paid enough attention to during the election campaign about a month ago when we chatted last. And tonight we're talking about equalization. Professor, you talked about the decider being, I think you said it was fiscal capacity. Is that correct?
Yes.
Most people would, I guess, have thought it would have been on sort of average income or provincial GDP or something like that. Explain to me, if you could, what fiscal capacity is.
Yeah, so it's the capacity of a province to generate revenues. And so the current formula, the equalization formula, the way it works is that you have 5 fiscal categories, 5 sources of revenue. So you have personal income tax, corporate income tax, you have a sales tax, sales taxes, property taxes, and then resource revenues, right? And in terms of the 4 first categories are mentioned, we look at what these provinces could raise if the tax rates were the same across the country. So it's not about what they actually collect in terms of taxes, but what their capacity to raise money is. For example, Alberta doesn't have a provincial sales tax, which is the only province in the country that doesn't have one. The equalization formula calculates the fiscal capacity of Alberta as if it had a provincial sales tax. So you look at the capacity to raise revenue rather than what they actually raise concretely.
Is that fair?
Then,
would an Albertan think that that's fair since they're not actually collecting that sales tax?
Well, it's a policy choice that they make. They are the only province that they are not using that opportunity to have a provincial sales tax. Alberta has by far the lightest tax burden in the country, and that's a policy decision of the province. But equalization is about really the capacity to raise revenues and not how much revenue you actually raise. Alberta being still the richest province in the country, they have more capacity to raise revenue. So although we calculate fiscal capacity, this is closely related to some of the metrics that you mentioned earlier, like GDP per capita or average income or median income, because if you have a richer province with richer inhabitants, it's easier to generate revenues.
Now, the Alberta economy was obviously devastated by the dip, not the dip, the cratering of oil prices during the last couple of years. It's come back in the last couple of months, but dipped fairly dramatically. But also things like the fires in Fort McMurray, and we've seen reports of 30% vacancy rate in downtown Calgary, et cetera, et cetera. How can they still be paying equalization, not a recipient of equalization, with those kinds of economic statistics?
Yes, first of all, no, Alberta doesn't pay equalization. All Canadians pay for equalization. It's financed through federal revenues, through the federal government. So all people pay for equalization. So I in Quebec pay taxes and federal taxes, and this is used to finance equalization, like your taxes in Ontario and taxes of people in Alberta or PEI. But of course, Albertans pay more taxes on average, federal taxes, because they are richer on average, still, despite the economic situation that we see right now. And what's important to understand is that the province doesn't receive equalization. So they contribute to it, but they don't receive anything back. While people in the 5 provinces that currently receive equalization, they contribute by paying federal taxes, but they also, of course, their province receives equalization payments. So it's a bit of a zero-sum game in the sense that some provinces don't receive anything, which is not the case with the Canada health transfer, which is much bigger in equalization. And actually, over time, equalization is shrinking in comparison to the Canada health transfer. So the Canada health transfer is becoming bigger and bigger over time, but also bigger than equalization proportionally over time. And it's true that what happened in Alberta is having a direct impact on equalization, in the sense that, or should have a direct impact on equalization, because inequalities among provinces are not as strong as what they were before the pandemic, and especially before the oil bust of 2014, right? So the disparities among provinces are lower than they were, and normally equalization should account for that. But because of a reform that was enacted under Stephen Harper, it's not exactly the case, because they created a ceiling, a cap on equalization payments. But right now, this cap has become, in a way, a floor, right? So it's quite technical, but what it means is that the equalization formula, the way we have it now, should probably be revised. And every 5 years, there is an opportunity, or on a regular basis, to revise that formula. Last time around, a few years ago, the Liberals said, no, we won't revise it. They just renewed. They basically, decided to prolong the life of this equalization formula. But we could certainly look into the formula, as a lot of things have changed in Canada since the early Harper years, when we adopted the formula that we have. And looking into this is important.
Can you simplistically try to tell me how a ceiling becomes a floor?
Well, because you basically try to control how much money is into equalization, right? But when disparities among provinces decline over time, then you still have this amount of money that is dedicated to it. And so this is distributed around the provinces. So it's a fixed pot of money that you
still have to distribute.
Exactly, yes. So, but there are other
problems. The disparities have gone down. Why don't we just get rid of equalization?
Well, there are still inequalities, and these fluctuate over time. So it's not because now they have declined that they will not, increase again in the near future. For example, if oil prices go back up in a strong way, Saskatchewan and Alberta will do much better, right? And maybe even Newfoundland and Labrador. So there are some fluctuations over time. Equalization has existed, as I said earlier, since 1957, and Canada has gone through a lot of, a lot of things, a lot of changes in terms of our economy and fluctuations in commodity prices and so forth. So equalization remains important, but you need to update the formula on a regular basis. And that's what we need to do. But that's not what really the referendum in Alberta was about.
Tell us about that referendum.
Yeah?
Tell us about the referendum.
So yeah, the referendum in Alberta was held last month at the same time as the municipal elections, province-wide, provincial municipal elections in Alberta. And the question that was asked to Albertans was about whether they wanted Alberta to move forward, try to remove the principle of equalization from the Constitutional Act, so the Constitution. And this is a general principle, but it's not the formula itself. There was nothing about amending the formula, revising how the program works. It's about removing the principle of equalization from the Constitution. But even if you will do that, and you can't do that as a province unilaterally, because you need support from at least 7 provinces representing half of the population of the country or more, right? And obviously the 5 provinces that receive equalization right now, they don't want to get rid of that principle. And there are other provinces a bit on the fence, like Newfoundland and Labrador, that will receive equalization again soon. So there is not enough support to get rid of this principle. But even if you will get rid of the principle, remove this from the Constitution, it doesn't mean that the program itself will be terminated, because the program was created in 1957, and the principle of equalization was only recognized in the Constitution in 1982. So you don't need that to be in the Constitution to have equalization. And equalization is under the sole purview of the federal government. It's a purely federal program. The provinces don't have a veto point over what the feds do in terms of equalization. It's their program financed through federal revenues. And so the referendum in Alberta is about the Constitution, but equalization is much more than that. And it's also a very technical program that most Canadians don't understand well. And that's the case of Albertans, Quebecers, Manitobans. It's just a fact that we have public opinion data about this. For example, my friend Jared Wesley from the University of Alberta conducted a poll across the province showing that most Albertans, they fail a very basic test when the time comes to assess their knowledge of equalization. And frankly, we'll do the same test in other provinces. The result will be probably very similar. It's a complex program. It's difficult to explain and to understand. But politicians say a lot of things about it, and often it's related to this idea of that is fair or unfair, but it's hard to assess whether it's fair or unfair if he doesn't know how it works. And that's the problem with equalization in a way. And also it's a zero-sum game, as I said. So some provinces don't receive equalization right now. And if they face other challenges, like you mentioned, a decline in oil revenues and so forth, then they might turn against equalization or say it's unfair. We want a better deal within the federal system. But in and of itself, even eliminating equalization would not necessarily improve the fiscal situation of Alberta, because Alberta doesn't qualify for equalization and will not qualify even if you will tweak the formula, at least right now. It might later into the future, but right now it's still too rich to qualify for equalization. But what Jason Kenney wanted to do with this referendum is use the referendum to get some leverage against Ottawa and say, look, Alberta wants a fair deal, wants a better deal with Ottawa in terms of other fiscal policies like fiscal stabilization program, which is a smaller program to help provinces that face these strong turbulence in terms of commodity prices, for example, commodity revenues. And he wanted to use the result of a yes at the referendum to pressure Ottawa to act. The problem is that the question of the referendum is about the Constitution. So Justin Trudeau just said, look, go to see the other provinces, Jason Kenney, talk to the other premiers, and get, if you get an agreement with some premiers, you have enough support for this, then we can talk. But of course, this won't happen because there is no way that you will find enough provinces to talk to Jason Kenney about this. Most of them are strongly opposed to this idea of removing equalization from the Constitution. Even some provinces like British Columbia that are not receiving equalization right now.
What was the result of the referendum?
So the yes side, yes to removing equalization from the Constitution, won by about 62%. Unfortunately for Jason Kenney, participation was very low at about 40%, a bit less than 40%. So fewer than 25% of eligible voters actually backed Jason Kenney and voted yes. Because when we talk about a referendum, it's not like an election. The percentage of the population who vote, the turnout, is very important. And a referendum with a very limited turnout has much less legitimacy than a referendum with a high level of turnout. For example, in Quebec, the 1995 referendum on sovereignty had a turnout of 93.5%, which is much higher than what you see at regular elections. But in the case of Alberta, it's a very low turnout, in part because it was coupled with municipal elections, which typically have lower turnout than federal or provincial elections, right? Yeah. And on the top of that, Jason Kenney right now is the least popular premier in the country. Jason Kenney is really unpopular.
Was this a victory for him or a defeat?
Sorry?
Was this a victory for Jason Kenney or a defeat?
It's a small victory, but the problem is that he's so unpopular that it doesn't help him much to have leverage, because Justin Trudeau and the other premiers, frankly, know that he's probably on his way out. I mean, he's at about 20% of support in the polls in terms of people who approve of his job, and the UCP, the United Conservative Party of Alberta, is trailing the NDP really badly in the polls right now. And there are quite a few people within his caucus who want to get rid of Jason Kenney.
I got to tell you, I was out in Calgary and Edmonton a couple of months ago, and they were saying, believe it or not, the NDP is coming back in Alberta.
It's absolutely possible. And that's why the UCP, the members of the party and MLAs, they will have to think about whether they want to keep Jason Kenney, because he's become a liability, in large part because of his botched management of the pandemic. The fourth wave in Alberta has been a real disaster. And Jason Kenney, came out in June and said, July 1st, it's over. It will be the best summer ever. And we'll go back to normal. We suspend most, if not all, most.
That worked for about 3 weeks.
For 3 weeks, and after that, cases started to pile up, and a lot of people have died. because of, I think, really botched response.
It's not a funny issue. There was
No.
a dramatic rise in infections and in mortality, and the ICUs and hospitals were at capacity. We're chatting tonight with Professor Daniel Beland from McGill University. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with him in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Dr. Daniel Beland. He's a professor at McGill University. He's actually director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. He has been there since 2018. Before that, he was the Canada Research Chair at the University of Saskatchewan for 10 years. And before that, he was an associate professor at the University of Calgary for 6 years. And before that, he was an assistant professor at Concordia University for a year. He's got a PhD in political sociology from the École des Hautes Études et Sciences Sociales in, where is that?
Paris.
And he's also got a PhD in, you got two different PhDs in political sociology. Is that correct?
No, I have one PhD.
Okay, but then best of all, this gentleman is was the classical music host on a CFCR community radio station in Saskatoon. That must have been a really fun gig.
Yes, for 9 years. So
fantastic.
I really enjoy my time. Yes.
So classical music is clearly one of your loves. That's wonderful. You talked a little bit about the size of the Canadian health transfers. You talked about social programs, and you talked about equalization, and that equalization was shrinking in size relative to the other programs. And you said that the health program was growing, and that provinces are asking it to grow even more. I wonder if you could give us some sort of quantification of that or sense of size. And then also, the big issue that we heard of in the last election was obviously childcare. And this childcare transfers, if the different provinces agree, and I think he's got almost every province now to agree, is going to be another big social program that's going to equate to a bunch of transfers. Is it not?
Yes. So if we start with the Canada Health Transfer, the provinces want more money. They want an increase in the size of the transfer of about $28 billion a year. I already told you it's about $45 billion a year already. So they want a massive increase in the size of the Canada Health Transfer. And they have used the pandemic as a way to justify this expansion. Because currently the federal government, in terms of the percentage of healthcare, provincial healthcare funding that's covered by the Canada Health Transfer will be about 22-23%. They want to up that to 35%. Ottawa is not
to 25% up to 35%.
Yes, that's what they want. So it's a massive increase.
That's a huge increase.
Yes.
Health is going to be the majority of the budget.
Not necessarily, but it will be very expensive for the federal government. That's for sure. And so there is resistance, I think, on the side of the federal government to give the provinces what they want. We saw that during the last federal campaigns on the part of the Liberals. Basically, they won't do this. But I think there is a strong case to be made that the provinces probably will benefit from having more money from the federal government, but the question is to know whether there will be some strings attached. Some provinces reject the idea that there will be any form of conditions attached to extra transfer. And so this is an ongoing debate about long-term care as well, where of course the needs are great, but there is no agreement on whether we should have national standards or norms of any kind. So there is an ongoing debate about healthcare funding. And I think there is a sense that, yes, healthcare is really expensive and the provinces do most of the heavy work on the ground, obviously, and that more federal money in healthcare is probably a good idea, but not necessarily what the provinces are asking. And especially the provinces want the money without any strings attached. And Ottawa is not keen to do that.
Can I ask you a question in that regard, just to probe you a little bit? I think lots of us have heard about longer wait times for
Yes.
different things in Canada versus the United States or other G7 countries. But it really came home to roost, I guess, about 2 weeks ago when I heard a show that Alberta and Saskatchewan were potentially at capacity in the ICUs and were flying people to BC or to Ontario and calling in the Canadian Army to do so. And the statistic referred to was that even though we've got a good healthcare system and we pride our healthcare system, Texas had 5 times as many ICU beds per capita as Alberta and Saskatchewan did. And we don't think of healthcare in Texas as being all that spectacular, frankly. And so, with that kind of statistic and the fact that we've got to then call in the Army to fly people around, clearly part of it may be that we didn't have the best policies in Alberta and Saskatchewan regarding COVID-19, but Texas didn't either. And why do we have 5 times less the ICU capacities on a per capita basis? That seemed astounding.
Yes. Well, the thing is that the United States, of course, spends more on healthcare than any other country in the world. Way more than Canada, way more than Germany, than France, as a percentage of GDP. So they spend a lot of money on healthcare, and a lot of it is waste. We don't need 5 times the ICU capacity that we have right now in Canada. It will be wasteful to do that. And I think that we can certainly expand capacity. But in that case, prevention is much better. And Texas has done a very bad job in terms of the pandemic. So we talked about Alberta earlier, but if you look at the numbers in Texas, they face problems. And in some places, ICUs were filled at capacity, even if they have much greater capacity than us, because the public health situation there was so dire. I know that my wife is from Texas, so I know the situation in Texas quite well. So, I think the United States is not really a model for healthcare in many ways, but we have to look at what, because they don't cover the entire population, and they also spend more than any other country. So I think we have to look at what's being done in East Asia, what's being done in Western Europe, and try to look at that, and also at the United States, but not always be fixated on the United States.
So the United States,
because frankly, they have a really strange healthcare system that there is no other healthcare system like that among rich countries.
Right.
They have their own path, but it's quite different than ours. We are closer to Sweden in a way in terms of our healthcare system or the UK than we are to the US.
So you probably know the exact statistics, but I think that on a per percentage of the GDP, we spend something around 10%, and they spend something like 20%, or maybe it's 18% of GDP on healthcare in the United States. But the 9 or 10% of GDP that we spend on healthcare is about the same, is it not, as Western Europe spends?
Yes, so it depends how you calculate, but yes, it's about average. What's important is that some countries spends more on pensions, on old age pensions, than on healthcare. But other countries, like Italy, for example, is a case. You have some countries in continental Europe, they spend more on old age pensions than on healthcare. In Canada, like in the UK and also in the US, we spend much less on old age pensions and much more on healthcare proportionally, which is very interesting. Canada is one of the most affordable old age pension system in the advanced industrial world. And also we are quite effective at fighting poverty among older people. What I want to say here too is that healthcare should not also be discussed in isolation from the welfare state as a whole and our other programs. Because Canada, we spend more on healthcare, but we spend much less on pensions, unemployment benefits. We have actually very low EI benefits if you compare to what many other countries have, advanced industrial countries. So in terms of spending, social spending, we are towards the bottom of the OECD, which is the club of rich countries. We are below average. And in terms of taxation, we're also below average, the OECD. So yes, we spend quite a bit on healthcare, although it's much less than the US proportionally. But we spend much less on the welfare state in general, pensions, benefits for the unemployed and so forth. So we have a pretty affordable welfare state overall and a tax burden that's still quite low compared to what you see in many European countries. Now, the United States, they have also low tax rates on average, but people pay high premiums, and they pay indirectly, employers pay for healthcare, and this has the cost. It's a burden for the economy. Even if individuals don't necessarily pay directly, this affects the competitiveness of large US firms.
Yes and no, because I think that what ends up happening is those firms make just as much money as they would have otherwise made, and they just pass it on to the consumer in higher goods prices for goods, which is effectively the same thing we do. We just do it through an HST, and they do it through higher consumer prices.
But they also pass the cost in a way to the workers by paying them less, which is another way they could also do it, right? So even if employers pay for part of healthcare, in the end, the fringe benefits, it might be decent one place, but employers will recoup the money by controlling wages. But better than I do, because I think you have an MBA from Harvard, so I'm not a business school person. But I do think that it's not because individuals you can pay for social benefits in different ways. You can pay through your taxes, but you can also pay through insurance premiums, or your employer can pay for this. But in the end, the cost will be passed to someone else. You're right. It can be to consumers or it can be to workers, but you don't necessarily know it, but it's what happens in the end.
So what do you think should happen in regards to sort of our fiscal federalism? Should equalization be really scaled back? Should it be overtaken by these healthcare transfers and childcare and other things? But what if you were Prime Minister or Minister of Finance, if Professor Daniel Beland was appointed Minister of Finance, what would you do?
The first thing I would do is create an expert panel on equalization, because the program hasn't been reviewed systematically in more than a decade, and a lot of things have changed in Canada in the last decade. So you appoint an expert panel on equalization, and you could also, even in the long run, make this panel permanent and have a permanent expert panel or expert commission that will review the equalization formula and other federal transfers on a regular basis, and in a transparent way come up with recommendations for the federal government that they could then enact in parliament or not, like they have done that in Australia since the 1930s. They have a commission, a federal commission, the Commonwealth Grants Commission, and they study equalization and they make recommendations to the government. The system that we have now is that you have the civil servants within the Department of Finance. They do their work, and then their political masters, they make the decisions. But it's not a very transparent process. And so I do think that we need to have this expert commission, at first, at least a temporary commission, to look into equalization and to fix the formula. And you're right, over time, probably that the pot of money available for equalization in proportion to the Canada Health Transfer should continue to decline, as long as inequalities among the provinces are declining, right? But in addition to fixing the issues with the equalization formula, healthcare funding is an area where I think Ottawa should spend more money, but I don't think that you should just give everything the provinces are asking for, because the numbers that I mentioned earlier about 20 for upping the federal contribution, say from 22 to 35% or 24 to this is not taking into account the fact that Ottawa in the past, especially in 1977, transferred what we call tax points to the provinces so that they can use this tax room to fund healthcare. And some provinces have used it, others not. But the provinces are reluctant to raise their own taxes, and now they want Ottawa to pay a greater portion of the bill. This discussion about tax room is also important. So who should collect the money? Should Ottawa leave more tax rooms to the provinces so that they can then decide to raise more money from their residents to fund healthcare? Another solution is that Ottawa will, you could imagine, for example, the GST could be like in Australia. What they do, they have the GST and they give the money to the states and the territories. And you could say, well, the GST will be the tax that we keep we keep the rate and then the provinces get that money or part of that money every year, and that's it. And you know, the GST is a growth tax in a way when you talk about the sales tax, and that will guarantee some stability, because what provinces want is stability, predictability, and yes, they want more money, but you know, there are a lot of ways that could be done. Not just sending, you know, writing a check to the provinces and telling them, you know, that's your money and run with it. I think we need to have a conversation about long-term care, and there should be some coordination here, even if there are not necessarily hard conditions. And so we need to have a discussion in this country about what should be done, rather than just writing a check to the provinces and saying, you know, it's your money and that's it. I do think that we need some real conversation, because healthcare is something that all Canadians care about, from coast to coast to coast, and the federal government has a role to play here, even if it's a very decentralized system that we have. So
the Premier of Quebec made some comments in regards to national standards, and that was completely inappropriate during the last election, and really wanted to support provinces parties that supported transfers without criteria. What do you think? Should there be national standards, or should it be just transferred from the federal government to the provincial government, so that the provincial government can spend it however they want?
You know, I think this is a false debate, in a way, a false opposition, because you can imagine transfers that will emerge in a bottom-up manner, or that provinces could agree on some. And actually, there is already a way through in the long-term care system, where you have where in order to be accredited, you need to meet certain criteria. So you could imagine that through this accreditation process, and maybe consultation or dialogue among provinces, that they could come up with their own standards. It doesn't mean that because you have national norms or standards that they have to come from Ottawa. They could be agreed upon norms or principles, and the provinces could work also with internally as well, consult with the providers, for example, in long-term care. So I don't think it has necessarily to be bottom up in that, you know, these norms or these principles can emerge from the provinces themselves. And that's what's happening right now. There is an accreditation process. It's not even a governmental process, but it's working. So I will avoid this very simplistic opposition, and Legault is falling into that trap, and others say, you have national norms or you have nothing, and it's the free for all. It doesn't have to be that way. And I think we need to have this dialogue, this conversation. And it's not that Ottawa should just impose these norms from the top, but the idea that, you know, there shouldn't be no discussion or no attempt to coordinate some of our efforts, especially in an area like long-term care, where so many people died, including here in Quebec during the pandemic, because the system is obviously flawed. And we knew that before the pandemic. So we have to work together to fix it, and yes, respect provincial autonomy. But provinces, I think, have to obviously collaborate with the federal government and with their counterparts and people within their own jurisdiction to improve things, and rather than just saying, give us the money and then we'll run away. And, you know, we should talk about how to improve things. Provinces can learn from one another. And here the federal government can play an interesting role too, helping provinces and Canadians to think about how we can improve the system without adopting a purely top-down approach of having hardcore, these kind of very tight strings attached.
That's one of the benefits of our federalism, isn't it? That we can learn from each other. You know, healthcare came from one province in the prairies in the 1950s, and then was extended across the country. And childcare came from one province, Quebec, in the 2000s, and is now being extended across the country. And so there is some benefit to different provinces trying things out, seeing if it works, seeing if it's beneficial, seeing if it's cost effective, and then if it works out, everyone else is going to adapt and copy it, if not the federal government imposing it.
Absolutely. In the United States, they use this term, you know, that states are laboratories of democracy, and we saw that during the pandemic as well. We saw some provinces doing better than others. For example, the Atlantic provinces, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, doing better than some other provinces. We saw that some provinces were able to improve, like Quebec did very poorly during the first wave, but much better during the fourth wave. For example, Alberta had the opposite way around. I think that we can learn over time from our own experience, from what's happening in other provinces, that the federal government could play a positive role. The federal government helped really diffuse Medicare across this country when it started to found it, right? So it started in Saskatchewan, but some other provinces were reluctant to adopt a similar model without federal funding. And that's what finally happened in the mid-1960s, in 1966. And now we have Medicare, and within the space of 5 years, we had Medicare all across the country. This is what's happening again. You're absolutely right regarding childcare. It's the second time we tried this. There was the agreements under Ken Dryden and Paul Martin in 2005. They were dismantled by Stephen Harper in 2006. And now, because the Liberals won another minority government, the most recent agreements are likely to survive. So it's a second attempt in a way at diffusing this Quebec model of subsidized childcare, but this one seems to be not unstoppable, but it seems to be likely to be fruitful. And so the federal government, again, is playing a leadership role, and that's what the federal government should do.
We're chatting tonight with Professor Daniel Beland. He's the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada at McGill University. He's been at the University of Saskatchewan, the University of Calgary, and Concordia University. Prior to that, a pretty smart guy. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. If you've listened to any of my programs, you know I love talking to really smart people, and tonight's been a real pleasure for me to speak with Professor Daniel Beland. He is the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada at McGill University, and we've been talking about equalization and fiscal federalism and healthcare and childcare and a whole bunch of other issues. Professor, what is it that you think we need to do in the future, and what are you doing personally yourself to help solve these issues?
Yes. First of all,
in regards to fiscal federalism, not the world.
Course. Yes. So the first thing that we need to do is have a conversation about this and not just let politicians talk about this, because they all have a vested interest depending on their level of government, their province, and so forth. We need to talk about what the needs are on the ground, what the federal government can do, and what the provinces and territories can do as well. We should also think about the fiscal capacity of municipalities, which are often left behind or pushed aside when we talk about fiscal federalism, but their needs are important, something we saw during the pandemic. So we need to have a conversation about this. And that's why, with a number of colleagues, I'm in the process of creating an independent commission on fiscal federalism in this country that will address the issues that we have talked about today. So it's a commission that is in the making right now, in collaboration with the Canada West Foundation and the IRPP, which is a think tank based in Montreal, Canada West based in Calgary. So we want to bring people from all across the country, experts, and also some former politicians, some former civil servants, to think about really how the world has changed, the economy has changed, and how we need to adapt our fiscal federal system to address these challenges beyond the bickering that we see coming from politicians, which is normal. They fight over money, but we need to think about really the future of the country. And if we don't fix fiscal federalism, I think that this is bad news for the future of Canada, because we are a very large country, and we have fought and we have debated over fiscal federalism since 1867. It's not something new. And we'll keep debating these issues over time, but we really need to take a look at the big picture, not just talk about equalization or Canada Health Transfer or fiscal stabilization separately. We need to talk about all these programs together and think about what our real priorities are and how we can work together, different provinces, the federal government, municipalities, to actually make our fiscal federal system more effective and also fairer.
Professor Daniel Beland, McGill University, Thank you so much for joining us and educating us on fiscal federalism, on equalization, on the issues, and how we need to think about it, because it's a part of what makes Canada, that we actually do share some of the risk of the downside, and that I didn't realize that every province at different times has been a recipient of equalization payments, even Alberta, even Ontario, and so you know what, that is interesting, and I think that all of us think of Canada as a nation, that all of us should be helping out our fellow citizens at different times. And so I think you've put it into excellent perspective, sir. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
You're most welcome. Take care.
That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Good night.